World War One is often seen as just a prologue to World War Two, as if it's simply the first episode of a bigger conflict that really starts in 1939. But if we look closer, we see something else. World War One is not just a war, it's a gigantic collapse of the old world. It's the moment when entire empires fell, dynasties that ruled for centuries disappeared, and the very idea of the old order, monarchies, imperial capitals, court balls, and 19th century style diplomacy vanished forever. Before 1914, Europe was a world of empires. The German Empire, with its shining parades and iron discipline, Austria-Hungary, a colorful mosaic of peoples from Prague to Sarajevo, the Russian Empire of the Romanovs, a giant stretching from Warsaw to Vladivostok, and the Ottoman Empire. Tired, but still a living remnant of the former glory of the sultans, these powers seem eternal. People were born and died, but the empires remain. Their palaces, armies, and anthems created an illusion of permanence. But in August 1914, this glittering yet fragile facade began to crack. World War One started as a conflict between states, but very quickly turned into a war of systems. Old monarchies, outdated bureaucracies, and traditional orders crashed into the reality of the industrial killing. Mass mobilization, total war economies, propaganda, artillery, gas trench warfare, and millions of dead. The empires were not prepared to pay such a price. To understand how exactly World War One killed an entire era, we need to look at each empire in turn, and at the same time see the bigger picture: hunger, exhaustion, national movements, revolutions, and the fall of prestigious dynasties. And most importantly, the fact that after 1918, the world simply could not go back. Before the war, Europe lived in an illusion of stability. Yes, there were crises, the Balkans were on fire, nationalism was growing. But elites believed that everything could be resolved with negotiations, alliances, and dynastic marriages. Emperors and kings were tied together by family bonds. Many of them were literally cousins. No one thought that a single deadly spark, the shot in Sarajevo, would be enough to burn down four empires at once. Let's start with the German Empire. In 1914, Germany was a European superpower, powerful industry, the strongest army on the continent, a dense railway network, a disciplined society. Kaiser Wilhelm II dreamed of a place in the sun, of colonies, and a fleet that could challenge Britain. German generals were certain the war would be short. The Schlieffen Plan promised a quick strike against France, then a turn to the east against Russia. Everything was supposed to end in a few months, but instead of a lightning victory, Germany crashed into the reality of positional warfare. The Western Front froze in trenches. The battles of Verdun and the Somme, endless offenses that cost hundreds of thousands of lives to gain a few kilometers. At home, the effects of the blockade were felt more and more. Shortages of food, fuel, and raw materials. The economy was working at its limits, everything for the front, everything for victory. Exhaustion was growing. The German Empire gradually turned into a military camp. Parliament still existed, but real power increasingly shifted to the military, to Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff. They controlled resources, planned offensives, and in practice ran the country. But the longer the war lasted, the clearer it became. Resources were finite, allies were weakening, and the enemies, especially the United States, which entered the war in 1917, were only gaining strength. The France began to collapse. In 1918, Germany launched one last massive spring offensive in the West, an all or nothing gamble. At first, there were successes, but then its strength ran out. American troops came to Europe by the hundreds of thousands. Their offensive stalled, and the Allied armies went on the counterattack. The German army retreated. Strikes and protests broke out inside the country. Soldiers were exhausted. Belief in the Kaiser's invincibility vanished. In November 1918, a sailors' uprising exploded in Kiel. They refused to sail into a suicidal final battle against the British fleet. Their protest quickly turned into a revolution. In cities, workers' and soldiers' councils appeared. The monarchy was cracking. Wilhelm II fled to the Netherlands. On November 9th, a republic was proclaimed. The German Empire ceased to exist, and the country signed an armistice recognizing defeat. Thus ended not only the history of one state, but also of the Hohenzollern dynasty. The empire that saw itself as a symbol of strength and order collapsed in a matter of weeks under the pressure of military failure, popular exhaustion, and revolutionary ideas. Now let's look at Austro-Hungary, one of the most fragile constructions of that era. It was a multinational empire with dozens of peoples: Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Ukrainians, Italians, and many others. In peacetime, this complex mosaic could be held together through compromises, bureaucracy, the army, and the authority of the Habsburgs. But the war became a fatal test for this structure. It was from Austria-Hungary that the chain of events leading to the war began. The assassination of heir to the throne, Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo became the pretext for an ultimatum to Serbia. When diplomacy failed, Austria-Hungary declared war, and then the alliance system collapsed like dominoes. The empire entered the war with an outdated army, weak industry, and deep internal contradictions. Battles on the Eastern Front against Russia, in the Balkans, and in the mountains against Italy all demanded enormous effort. Casualties grew, the economy suffocated. Millions of soldiers of different nationalities fought under one flag, but did they truly feel like part of a single empire? With each failure, the national question intensified. Czech, South Slavic, and Romanian leaders increasingly spoke of independence. In exile, committees were formed that negotiated with the Entente, promising support in exchange for the creation of new states. Austria-Hungary was gradually losing legitimacy in the eyes of its own citizens. By the end of the war, the empire was a worn-out organism, torn apart by hunger and internal conflicts. In the cities, there were bread lines, fuel shortages, inflation. At the front, desertions and refusal to fight. Attempts to maintain order no longer worked. Once it became clear the war was lost, an avalanche began. One after another, peoples proclaimed their own states. Czechoslovakia, the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Romania expanded, and Poland returned to the map. Emperor Karl I tried to reform the empire, proposing federalization and autonomy for the peoples. But it was too late. In the autumn of 1918, Austria-Hungary, in fact, no longer existed. The empire ruled for centuries, but the Habsburgs disintegrated in a matter of weeks, leaving behind a map full of new borders. Now, the Russian Empire. Before the war, it was a giant with enormous territory and vast human resources, but also with countless internal problems: industrial backwardness, peasant poverty, an unresolved land question, and weak trust in the authorities after the 1905 revolution. Nicholas II, the last emperor, believed in his divine mission but was detached from reality. Russia entered the war as an ally of France and Britain. Mobilization was staggering in scale, but the army was poorly supplied and the command suffered catastrophic failures. In the first years alone, the country suffered massive losses. In the rear, food shortages grew, transportation was overloaded, and the economy struggled to cope. People were exhausted, but the war went on. By 1916 to 1917, the situation had become critical. In the capital, there were queues, hunger, and soaring prices. Soldiers, tired of pointless attacks, lost faith in their commanders. In February 1917, mass protests broke out in Petrograd. Women took to the streets over bread shortages. Workers joined them, then soldiers. The emperor tried to suppress the uprising, but the army was no longer willing to shoot at the people. Mutinies began in the garrisons. In the end, Nicholas II abdicated. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for more than 300 years, fell. Power passed to the provisional government, which tried to continue the war, hoping to keep its alliance obligations and avoid a humiliating peace. But the people no longer wanted to die for slogans about honor and duty to the Allies. In the autumn of 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, launched an armed uprising promising peace, land, and bread. The October Revolution overthrew the provisional government, and the new regime signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, effectively taking Russia out of the war. But the price was enormous territorial concessions and the beginning of a civil war that became a separate tragedy. For world history, the key point is this: the Russian Empire ceased to exist. In its place arose a new state with a completely different ideology. Under the thunder of World War I, on the ruins of the Romanov Empire, Soviet Russia appeared, and later the USSR, and finally the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, as it had been called since the 19th century. Once it controlled vast lands from the Balkans to the Middle East, but by the early 20th century it had greatly weakened. National movements in the Balkans, territorial losses, a weak economy, and an outdated army all undermined the foundations of the state. When World War I began, the Ottoman leadership bet on an alliance with Germany and Austro-Hungary, hoping to restore influence and regain lost territories. But the war became a series of severe trials for the Ottoman Empire. The Gallipoli campaign, the Caucasus Front, Arab uprisings, and the British offensives in the Middle East. Inside the empire, tragic events unfolded, including the persecution and deportation of the Armenian population, one of the most painful pages of the 20th century. On the periphery, resistance grew. Arab leaders, backed by Britain, dreamed of creating their own states. Ottoman authority was losing control over the provinces. By the end of the war, the Ottoman Empire was essentially exhausted. The defeat of its allies meant its own collapse. After the war, the victors carved up former Ottoman territories, mandates in Syria, Iraq, Palestine, spheres of influence across the Middle East. Istanbul itself was occupied. Inside the country, a national movement flared up under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal. As a result of the War of Independence and the abolition of the Sultanate, a new state was born, the Republic of Turkey. The Ottoman Empire disappeared along with 1,000 years of Sultanate history. So, in just 4 years, from 1914 to 1918, four empires fell. the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman. But it's important to understand they didn't just lose a war, they became victims of a clash between the old world and the new. World War I showed that monarchies based on the authority of dynasties and traditions could no longer rule societies that had gone through total mobilization, mass death, hunger, and destruction. The people who returned from the front were no longer the same. Millions of soldiers who had endured trenches, gas, and artillery barrages had seen how easily states disposed of their lives. They no longer believed in the sacredness of crowns and titles. On the wave of imperial collapse, new forces rose republics, nation states, and revolutionary movements. Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes appeared. On the ruins of empires, new borders were drawn, often in the offices of politicians, without taking into account all national and historical specifics. This created time bombs that would explode later in World War II and even after it. It's also important that the end of the empires changed the very idea of politics. Ideologies came to the forefront: communism, fascism, radical nationalism. People searched for new answers to the question, what comes next? The old system had collapsed, but the new one had not yet stabilized. This vacuum became the space for new dictatorships, new conflicts, and new wars. World War I ended an entire era, the era of the long 19th century, when Europe lived by the logic of empires, royal courts, and great power diplomacy. After 1918, a different history begins: the history of mass politics, totalitarian regimes, global crises, and attempts to build international organizations designed to prevent new wars. But above all, World War I revealed the fragility of any eternal structures. Empires seemed unshakable, but 4 years of trenches, hunger, mutinies, and revolutions destroyed them. People living in these states could wake up in one world and find themselves in another. Soldiers returning home no longer to an empire but to a new republic. Peasants who had recently been subjects of a Tsar now listening to speeches about socialism. Inhabitants of provinces suddenly turned into citizens of new nation states. Their familiar identity, subject of the emperor, resident of the empire, disappeared. World War I ended the age of empires but did not bring lasting peace. On the contrary, it left enormous wounds, humiliation, and a sense of injustice. This was especially true for Germany, which, after the Treaty of Versailles, felt not just defeated but humiliated. That feeling became fertile soil for revenge and the rise of Hitler. The breakup of Austria-Hungary created many small states with tangled borders and national conflicts. The collapse of the Russian Empire led to civil war and the emergence of a powerful communist state that became an alternative to the capitalist world. The Ottoman legacy in the Middle East produced dozens of disputed territories and conflicts, many of which remain unresolved to this day.